Well, greetings everybody from sunny England. So just a couple of other words of introduction. I've had three roles in life. My first was as a local pastor, and my first church was precisely what we're talking about tonight. It was a very old church that had been in decline for many years, and our task was to, in a sense, replant the church. And although I didn't realize it at the time, we were using church planting principles to renew the congregation. And so that's really what we're talking about this evening. I spent 15 years in local ministry, planting churches, as well as working with the first congregation that I've just mentioned. And then 15 years with Bible Society, which was mainly a training role. But also reflecting on what does it mean to be a worker and a missionary in a Western European context. But of course, that has broadened over the years to be Europe more generally. And then for the last 15 years, I've been working as the principal of a college that is training people, mainly church planters, for a European context. Many of them plant churches here in England, but they don't restrict themselves to England. And we're pleased to say that some of the folks that train with us go and plant churches in other places. So that's a little bit of my background. Some of you I know from the past. I've had contact with some of you. And so it's a delight to be able to share with you this evening. I know that English is not a first language for all of you. And so I will try and speak slowly and hopefully clearly. And I hope that you can understand my particular version of English. And as you know, there are many versions of English in the world today. So let's just make a start. And I want to begin by tackling the question of leadership, because leadership is always an issue when we are either planting a church or renewing our congregation. And one of the issues that first arises is this question, well, who is a leader? Is everybody a leader? And there are many different points of view on that question. So normally I'd have a bit of a discussion in a class setting. That might be a bit difficult tonight. So let me just share with you the range of views on that particular topic. Some would say, no, leaders are born. Only some people are leaders. And the idea there is that you can enhance somebody's leadership skills, but leadership is something that is placed in us from the very beginning. And then others would say, well, no, actually, everybody's a leader, potentially, in the sense that everybody can lead in something. And so there's quite a range of views on that particular topic. But whatever view we take, we can certainly say that in working with congregations, we really want to try and develop as many leaders as we possibly can. To lead in some aspect of the work of the church, whether it's with youth or whether it's with new Christians or whether it's with leading small groups. One of the great challenges for us is always to see, well, how can I enhance the potential leadership skills? And obviously, to a certain extent, one is always wanting to add to the number of leaders, because a church is limited in its ability to grow by the number of leaders we can produce. So that's one of the first questions that anybody who's leading a church will want to address. How can I multiply the number of leaders in a given situation? And that's where local training can be good. Sometimes we can bring other kinds of training to bear, sending people on various leadership courses. but it has to be a priority to ask the question, how can we enhance the leadership potential of those that we have in the congregation? And one of the reasons for doing that is that we want to encourage people to be able to look at our situation afresh. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. When I went to my very first church, by the time I got there, the average attendance was 22 people. They were mostly elderly people, and their experience of church had been one of decline. They'd only ever known a church that was declining. And of course, that was quite depressing. They'd only ever seen decline, 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 decline. And of course, that experience of decline meant that it was difficult for them to see the potential of their situation, because they actually didn't think it had any potential. And so the challenge really is, how do you help people to look at their situation through completely new eyes? I've certainly spoken to many leaders in Eastern Europe whose vision of what's possible has been often shaped by the experience of communism. And when the communist regimes were ended, that didn't necessarily help people to see things through new eyes. So how do we help our leaders to see things afresh? That's one of our challenges. And I guess one of the things that I would suggest is that in leading a congregation to growth, it's quite important in the very early stages to try and get some wins, to tackle something that is an encouragement, where the congregation suddenly sees, well, actually, no, there is some potential here that they perhaps hadn't seen before. So a challenge might be to say, okay, how can we locate some kind of win? That might be an evangelistic initiative, it might be a youth initiative, it might be all kinds of things. But in a sense, the challenge is to try and locate something that will be an encouragement to the church to be able to say, you know what, there's potential here that I hadn't seen before. So leaders are called to help people see things from a new perspective. So getting a quick win might be the first thing that you do in your first year of leadership. Now, part of getting that win relates to what we might call the apostolic gift. Now, what do I mean by the apostolic gift? Well, there are some people who have the ability to start new things. Now, in many cases, that would be perhaps church planting, but we're not talking about church planting as such tonight. We're talking about working with an existing congregation. Now, you might be that apostolic leader yourself that can bring that gift of starting new things, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're just somebody, or not just somebody, maybe you're somebody who has got a strong pastoral gift, a strong teaching gift. And one of the questions you might want to ask is, where can we draw upon apostolic gifting? Now, let me just define what I mean by apostolic gifting. I'm not talking about an office. I'm not talking about a position. I'm not talking about a title. I'm talking about a gifting. And that gifting is that ability to, yes, see things afresh, get some wins, begin new things. And sometimes it's a good idea to look around for people, resources maybe, that are possibly outside of the congregation, to say, how can we borrow somebody that's got that gift? Because they might be the person that can help us, work alongside us for a period, to help the congregation to see things from a new point of view. So that's where some leadership from outside might be a good thing, even if it's only for a relatively short period of time. Maybe it's somebody who could act as a consultant, an advisor, a critical friend. But sometimes it's good to just ask that question. Who can we draw upon to enable the congregation to be renewed by virtue of their gifting as some kind of apostolic person, to give us that kind of fresh view, fresh initiative from the outside? So what we're looking for in all of this is the opportunity to renew leadership. And that's actually quite important, because often leaders in an existing situation, as I've already indicated, they may be feeling defeated. They may be feeling tired. They may be feeling, do you know what, we've tried everything before and nothing has worked. So the challenge sometimes is, how do we renew leadership? And that might mean we need to bring in fresh leaders into the situation. Those might be people that join the congregation from outside, that we maybe even borrow for a time. Or it may be that there are people who are emerging in the situation that need to be encouraged and brought into leadership. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, because inevitably those who are already in leadership tend to resist the introduction of new leadership. So that's another one of our challenges. How do we spot the potential leaders, and how do we bring them into leadership in ways that are not going to be threatening to the existing leaders? Sometimes we need to take drastic action. I remember one church where the the situation was so difficult that the leaders from outside said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to close this congregation and we're going to reopen it 60 seconds later. But the point of that is that in reopening it, we're actually going to appoint new leaders. Now that's a pretty drastic step to take. And I hope you don't have to do something as drastic as that. But it just underlines the fact that it is important to begin to think about that leadership issue. I know that Holy Trinity Brompton, when they are replanting churches into existing buildings, they will often ask the existing leadership to stand down. That becomes a condition of their offering help. That they say to the existing leaders, look, you do need to stand down, and we're going to bring in new leadership as part of the renewing of the congregation. Tough issue, but it's something that we at least need to think about, because actually part of the problem can often be that some congregations only exist because of the determination of some existing leaders, but it can't grow with those same leaders. So the very people that have maintained the work are sometimes the blockage to seeing it grow and develop. So that's, again, something that one needs to think about. How do we renew the leadership that we've already got? And that brings us to the question of leadership styles. Now, there isn't time to go into this in a great deal of depth, but again, there's a range of leadership styles, and we just need to take time to think about how is leadership going to work in this situation? Is it going to be a leadership that listens and, in a sense, leads from by drawing together the views of others? Or is it going to be a leadership that says, no, I'm going to take the initiative and others will need to follow the lead? Now, neither of those styles are right or wrong. You have to make a decision about what kind of leadership is going to be helpful in this situation. Is it going to be a very directive leadership, or is it going to be a very consultative style of leadership? So again, that's something that needs to be on your agenda to think through, given the situation that we're in, what's going to be the best style of leadership to use in this situation. So let's move on to the next slide, and let's move to the question of team. Now, certainly in church planting, team is really critical. And I would take the view that leadership is always more than one. I would say nobody has all the leadership gifts. So if we take, for example, the way of describing leaders as apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, you can see that in that it's very unlikely that somebody's going to have all 5 of those gifts. So one of the things that we're looking to do in renewing a congregation is to ask the question, where are those gifts? Who have that apostolic role, introducing new thoughts? Who can have that prophetic role, getting that sense of where God might be speaking, where God might be at work? And God might be at work outside of the congregation, in the community, for example. Who's got that prophetic gift? Who's got the ability to share the gospel effectively? Not everybody will be an evangelist, but can you recognize people who've got those gifts? We do need pastors, we do need teachers who've got those kinds of gifts, especially when it comes to new Christians joining the church. Who's got the ability to pastor them effectively, integrate them in the life of the church? Who's got the ability to teach them in such a way that they don't just remain as believers, but they become disciples? So leadership is always more than one. And it's very important to begin to think, I'm going to try and build a team here. Who can be part of that team? Which leads us to the question of the nature of team. What is the nature of team? And it's a very difficult thing to do, actually, I think, to create team. One good test of whether or not you've got a team is to look at what happens in the interaction when you bring your team together. Let's imagine you've got a team beginning to develop. And what I like to do sometimes when I'm watching teams is to look at who is talking to whom. Is it only the team leader that people are relating to, or are they genuinely relating to each other? So that process of helping people to integrate in such a way that they are developing a mutuality of relationship and not just a relationship with the single team leader. That's an indication of what might be going on. Now, how do we produce a situation like that? Well, that's all about team building. And I want to encourage you, actually, perhaps we can move the PowerPoint on a little bit to come on to that PowerPoint on team, if you can get to that one. So the next line on the PowerPoint is the line developing team. So developing team, I want to just emphasize a couple of things. Sometimes I go to teams and what they always seem to be doing is discussing business. Now, obviously, teams need to discuss business, that's fine. But I would also say, look, a team is about more than business. So I want to ask the question, are you having fellowship time together, which would include typically, let's eat together. Relationships in a team change when we have meals together. relationships in a team change when we pray together. Relationships in a team change when we ask the question, are we having fun? Now that might seem like a strange question, but certainly in the team that we're in our local church, we often stop maybe every 6 months and we ask that question, are we having fun? Because it's actually quite a good guide to how the team is developing to ask that question. If this is just hard work, if this is just all business, if this is just all extracting from the team members their contribution, then actually maybe we're not having fun. So how we play together and how we pray together is as important as the planning together. So let's make sure that there are all three elements in team meetings: playing together, praying together, planning together. I won't say that they all have to occupy the same amount of time, but they all have to be present if we're going to be able to develop teams effectively. Well, I'm moving on to the next line on that same PowerPoint, which says, looking for external resources. It's hard work building teams, and sometimes we do need some help from outside. And two particular types of help are worth thinking about. The first is help from somebody that we might describe as a coach. Now, a coach typically asks the question, how is the task going? What are your goals? Are you achieving the goals? What's lacking if you're not achieving the goals? Where can you get some help in terms of achieving those goals? So a coach is a useful ingredient. So I would encourage new church plants, but also churches that are trying to replant themselves, to ask that question: where can I find a coach that will hold us to the task? And the second resource that's really useful and often needs to come from outside is what I would call a mentor. And the distinction for me is that a mentor doesn't ask about the task, but it asks about the people. How are the people doing? How are you going? How are you developing in your walk with the Lord? How are you developing in terms of your personal goals for your personal life? So giving the team access to both mentors and coaches would be useful in terms of building the team. So those are some of the elements for me in building a team. Recognizing that you need a team, leadership is more than one. The nature of the team, which is how we develop significant relationships in the team. Here we go now with the PowerPoints, that's good. Then looking at how we develop the team in terms of praying together, playing together, as well as planning together, and then looking for external resources, particularly in terms of the person who can act as a coach, the person who can act as a mentor. So those are some ways of building the team. Let's see if we can come on to the next PowerPoint. If you can bring that up, that'd be really helpful. Now we're going to talk about some of the very basic ingredients in the renewal of a church. And that's, first of all, to do with how do others see us. Now, what I mean by that is very often we have a particular view of who we are and what we're like, but actually people coming in for the first time might have a different view. So I went to one church, I was working with one particular church, and I asked them the question, how friendly is this church? And they said to me, everybody reported, we're amazingly friendly. And at the end of each service, I was the only new person there, and I noticed that actually, I felt like I was ignored. I was completely on the outside. And what I realized was that they had what we sometimes call the disease of fellowshipitis. In other words, they all talked to each other, but they didn't have an eye for those who were coming in for the first time. So we need to ask the question: what would it feel like for somebody coming into this place for the very first time? I met one pastor who took a very radical step, and he actually invited a number of people. In fact, I think he even paid a number of people to come in to the congregation for the first time and to report how they experienced the congregation. And then he fed that feedback to the congregation, and they got a shock, because actually those who were coming in as outsiders had a very different view of what they were experiencing from those who were very used to worshiping in that situation. So 3 questions that we need to address in terms of asking, how do others see us? First of all, the way we worship. Now, obviously, the way we worship suits those who are already worshiping. That's why it's constructed the way it is. But actually, it might not be accessible to those who are coming in for the first time. How understandable is the language that we're using? Are we using kind of code words that are just a puzzle to those who are coming in for the first time? Are we so used to worshiping in a particular way that we are used to certain things happening in a certain order, but we don't explain what's happening, so that somebody from the outside is feeling, whoa, I really am a stranger here. In fact, I'm not only a stranger, but I feel isolated. So it's worth asking the question, how would others see the way we're worshiping? Is it being explained to people what's going on here, so that it's not intimidating or threatening? And in that context, we need to ask the question, how do we develop a culture of welcome? It's very, very important that those who come for the first time are spoken to by probably at least 3 people in the congregation, not just as they come in for the first time, but after the service. Are they just allowed to leave without any conversation, or do 2 or 3 people greet them, make them feel welcome, make them feel comfortable? And how are we going to follow them up? How do we know who they are, and how do we encourage them, in other words, to return? So the way we worship, the way we welcome, but also the way we pray. What's happening in this place in terms of prayer? Do people as individuals have a strong prayer life? Does the congregation have a strong emphasis on prayer, not just on the occasions when we worship, but in other places? Congregations are generally renewed because of the spiritual quality of that congregation. How do we celebrate the answers to prayer? One of the churches that I led for a time had a weekly prayer meeting, and we realized that actually we never shared with each other the answers to our prayer. And so a weekly practice that we'd keep a record of the things we prayed for, and each week we'd ask the question, have our prayers been answered? And actually it was tremendously encouraging to realize that week after week after week, God had answered our prayer. And so what that did was it encouraged a sense of confidence around prayer, and gave the congregation a renewed sense of the importance of prayer. We're not involved in a battle with flesh and blood, but we are involved in a spiritual battle, and we need to be sure that the basics of prayer are in place if we're going to see the spiritual temperature of the congregation raised up. So how do others see us in terms of worship? How do they experience welcome? Is there a deep sense that because this congregation prays, God is in this place? I wonder how people feel for the first time coming in. Is God present? Do they sense that this is a place which is not just a social occasion, but God is actually deeply involved in everything that's happening? Is he evidently present because the people in this place pray and are expectant that God turns up? I remember the very first church that I was leading, my first experience was, to be honest, the worship was terrible. It was boring. And after a couple of years, I realized that something had changed. And one of the things that had changed, undoubtedly, was this sense that because the congregation had begun to pray and pray with passion, that actually, as people came into worship, there was a clear expectation that it wasn't just us that had turned up, but God was going to turn up. God was turning up on a regular basis, and we were seeing that made a difference. So these are the basics that we need to be in place if we're going to see renewal happen. Let's see if we can move to the next slide, if that's possible. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah. So we've been talking about the life of the church, but now we need to think about the life outside of the church. And the first question that we need to ask is, who are we trying to reach? Now, usually when I ask that question of congregations, what often happens is that they answer that question by saying, we're trying to reach everybody. Now, of course, in reality, we're not trying to reach everybody. We can't reach everybody. And we need to be a bit more discerning about who we're trying to reach. For example, is there a particular neighborhood that we're trying to reach? Usually, there is actually a neighborhood. Some churches have clear parish boundaries. Some churches don't have clear parish boundaries, but whether we have a parish boundary or whether we don't, actually, usually the congregation has a sense that there is an area of a town or city that we are trying to reach. Sometimes if it's a small community, maybe we're trying to reach an area which is bigger than the immediate community. But we just need to be clear about who we're trying to reach. And in the context of that, we need to be asking the question, well, if these are the people that we're trying to reach, how would people know that we exist? How would they have some sense of what we do? How would they have some contact with us? How would they have an opportunity to hear and understand the message that we're transmitting? Who are we trying to reach? How do we define the neighborhood that we're working in? Now, sometimes we can have a very clear sense of the neighborhood that we are trying to reach, but being honest about it, we're not really able to reach every type of person in that neighborhood. And again, we need to ask some tough questions. Are there particular groups in the neighborhood that we have a better opportunity to reach? For example, are we better at reaching young people? Are we better at reaching children? Are we better at reaching older people? How do we see our neighborhood? How do we see where the best opportunities are? And we can often get at that by asking, well, let's just ask that question. Who actually lives in this neighborhood? Do we really know who lives in the neighborhood? Are there new kinds of people moving into the neighborhood that we need to be aware of? Very often churches grow more easily by contacting those who have moved in. Actually, those who have moved into a neighborhood are more open in the first 6 months to a year that they move than those who've lived there for a long time. So who's living in the neighborhood? What's changing in the neighborhood? In other words, we need to be asking ourselves, how do we observe this neighborhood? What actually goes on in this neighborhood? Who are the important groups? Are there schools that are important? Are there other social groups that are important? What is actually happening in this neighborhood? And that leads us to ask the question, what are the needs of the neighborhood? Our local church asked people in the neighborhood to tell us, well, what are the needs in this neighborhood? Actually, we were very surprised by the answers. They actually gave us 3 answers. The first thing they said was something we would never have thought of. They said, actually, there's no playground for children in this area. Now, to be really honest with you, that had never occurred to us. But actually, we were in a position where we had space to build a playground. And so we did. We built a playground right next to the church. And that completely changed our relationship with people in the area. The second thing they said was there's no place for us to sit down with our friends, our neighbors, and have a cup of coffee. We were able, we had the means to put a cafe in our church building. And we were able to place the cafe right next to the new playground. Well, the contacts that brought were amazing. And the third thing that people said was there's nothing for young people to do. And so we were able, as a second step in our development, to employ a youth minister who was not only working with the youth in the church, but working with youth in the neighborhood. Now, those might not be the needs in your area, but what are the needs in your area? The people to answer that question are the people who don't come to our church. So let's move on to what I think is the last slide. Let's ask this question. How would we change the conversation that exists or doesn't exist between our church and the neighborhood? What is the conversation at the moment? Now, very often when I go to churches, especially those who've been in decline for a long time, the only conversation that exists is a question from the congregation to the neighborhood, which basically says, why don't you come to our church? There was a time when you did come to our church. You don't come to our church now. In a sense, they're saying, what's wrong with you? Now, that's not a very helpful conversation. So how do we develop a different kind of conversation? Well, one of the ways we do it is something I've just indicated, that we ask people what the needs are. That's actually one way of changing the conversation, beginning a new conversation. But there are also other ways. And one of the most important ways is to identify what we sometimes call people of peace. Now, that particular phrase comes from the passage in Luke's Gospel where Jesus sends out the 70 and he instructs them that when they find a receptive home, they're to pray peace upon that home. These are people of peace that God has prepared, and they often give us access to the community. My very first church that I described earlier, actually nobody in the neighborhood came to our church. And in desperation, we decided we'd go door to door and try and reach people for Christ. To our amazement, in the first 100 homes that we called on, something like 20 people said that they would like to come to a study on the life of Jesus. 12 actually came and 6 got converted. That was our breakthrough moment. And I realized afterwards that the reason we'd been successful was because the very first home that we called on was populated by somebody who was a person of peace. Everybody in the street knew this person. And when we were knocking on each door, they asked the question, well, where would this group meet? And when we said it's going to meet in such and such a home, they said, oh, well, we're interested then. And it wasn't because of us, it was because they knew that person. That was a person of peace. So who are the people of peace in your neighborhood? that you can begin to build a relationship with and can give you the key, if you like, to access that neighborhood. People of peace are often the best people to give us an awareness of the needs in a neighborhood. So I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly mention that one of the things that we need to do out of all this sense of a renewed sense of who we are as a local church, a renewed sense of our relationship with the community, is to ask ourselves the question, over the next 12 months, what might be our best opportunity for growth? The fact of the matter is that most congregations have got lots of opportunities, but we don't have the ability to pursue all of those opportunities at the same time. So we need to create a strategy that says, let's begin with the opportunities that will give us the most potential for growth. We just can't do everything. So we need to do one thing and do that one thing well. And when we've done that and succeeded in that, we can move on to the next thing. So a strategy for growth asks the question, what are our best opportunities in relation to the resources we have, the opportunities we have, and let's do those few things well so that we can begin to see growth take place. Well, I've talked for the allotted time, so let's come back to our Q&A time, and we can remove the PowerPoints now so that we can see each other. Hopefully that will happen. Yes, it's beginning to happen. So let's open it up and feel free to ask any question you like. No question is too trivial. No question is too impossible. So whoever would like to speak, feel free to do so now.
Well, Martin, in light of Peter Wagner's famous quote that church planting is the most effective way of evangelism, or whatever it was he said, isn't it better just to plant new?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. So I think we need to be doing both things. I think the point about existing congregations is that they often have an existing relationship with the community that actually, if we use church planting principles to replant the congregation, actually we can take advantage of those opportunities, the relationship that they have with the community, which might take a new congregation a very long time to develop. But having said that, sometimes the strategy that we need to use is actually a very conscious strategy of saying something like this. Actually, to be really honest, we can't bring people into this existing congregation. Changing the congregation is just too difficult. And so we need an agreement with the congregation that looks something like this. I will be a chaplain to your existing congregation. I won't ask you to change anything. We're going to keep everything the same. But you must allow me to develop another congregation alongside you. And in the future, the congregation that we develop will actually be the only congregation. But there might be a 5 or 10 year period where I act as a chaplain to the existing congregation and allow the resources of that congregation to be used to develop something new in parallel. Now that's a pretty radical strategy, and that can only work with the consent of the existing congregation. But sometimes that's the only way to do it. I've certainly visited congregations where I've come to that conclusion. I just honestly couldn't bring people into this congregation. It's just too big a jump for the existing congregation. But if congregations are willing to accept particularly new leadership, then actually there is hope that revitalisation can take place, and the existing resources of the congregation can be a blessing.
Okay.
It's a tough decision to make, though. It's in the end, it's a judgment call, isn't it? As to what's best. Sometimes that might be if developing a youth congregation, for example. If there's lots of older people, in the congregation. It's just not going to work to bring lots of young people in. It'd be cruel to the existing congregation and impossible for the young people. So sometimes, we need to develop that kind of very different congregation in parallel.
Martin, I've really found that it's a great example of the gospel to a community, that if a church has declined and it's become forgotten by the neighborhood, to allow the community to see something that was dead and they've forgotten about it, they think it's dead, to be able to see it come back to life.
Yeah.
It's just a great testimony and a great example to the lost and to the whole community of God is in the business of bringing things that are dead back to life. And, I think it's just a great stewardship to be able to fight for declining churches, even churches that have closed their doors, to be able to go in and see if a Bible study or something just can't be started. I work with a lot of church planters, and I just know that there are communities and there are places that we need to plant new churches. But you go through all the effort, all the work, to reach a community, get a church going, and then you're either renting a space or you're in someone's home and you're constantly looking to raising the financial funds to lease a building, to buy a building, to build a building, whatever it might be, when God has already, raised the money through Christians and saints that have gone before us and have these phenomenal church buildings already ready, that if we can go in and revitalize or replant a church, like you said, it's just being a phenomenal steward of what God's already gone before us and done. I mean, there's a reason that God had that church planted on those street corners, and whether it's declining today or not, he had a purpose and still has a purpose for the people in that community in that building.
Absolutely, Jeff. And I think actually that raises a very interesting question. What was the original DNA of that congregation? What was God's DNA? What was his purpose in planting the church? Because often what has happened is that the church that currently exists has lost touch with its original DNA. And if we can recover that DNA, then actually you often get more permission from the existing church, because they recognize the DNA when it's pointed out to them. So, for example, again, the first church that I went to try and renew, as we brought new people in, the existing congregation did actually object. They said, well, these aren't the right kind of people. And so we had a problem, because actually the existing congregation had originally lived in that neighborhood, but they'd moved out as they'd become successful. So they were now doctors, lawyers, teachers, professional people, and it was a working class neighborhood. So we asked the question of the existing congregation, why did this church come into being in the first place? And actually they all knew the answer, and the answer was to reach the poor. So I was able to say, well, if that was the reason God brought it into being, we're bringing the poor in now. So isn't that what God originally intended? And actually, I got the cooperation of the people once we'd made that connection with the original DNA. So what's the DNA? Now, sometimes that you will sometimes come across churches where, if you like, the DNA is exhausted, the original purpose has been fulfilled, and you can't recreate it. Okay, fine. It's okay to say, well, then in that case, maybe it is the occasion to close the church. But even in that situation, look, they've got a building. Aren't they willing to donate it to somebody else? One of my students is working in the Newcastle area, just south of Newcastle, and they'd started in a rented building, and a local church that was on the point of closure saw what they were doing and recognized that actually they were doing what they should have done but failed to do. And they gave them the building. They said, we're going to close, but you can have the building. That was extraordinarily generous of them. They also gave them their existing funds, which was amazing. Now that's, pretty drastic step, but it was a way of using resources which were intended for the kingdom of God. Okay, it was a different denomination, it was a different style of worship, it was a different people group, but the resources were not wasted, and that was great.
Martin, have you seen that very much there in Europe? I mean, we're starting, and I'm in a Denver, Colorado, and in the western part of the United States, and in the southern part of the United States, other parts of America, the denominations won't talk to each other. They're very, staunchly on each side of their street. Yeah. Where in the western U.S., we're seeing more exactly what you shared of, some mainstream denominations with, some more conservative denominations coming together and doing partnerships, just like you're talking about. Is that something that you've seen a lot of, or is it fairly rare there in other parts of the world?
I think in Europe, that's something that's just growing. I think the very reality of the secular challenge has caused Christians to be more open to one another, and partnership is very much on the agenda these days. That which divides us is of very little consequence compared to that which unites us. So yeah, I think there's a much greater openness to partnership, sharing of resources than there's ever been. It's encouraging.
Yes, just to share, Martin, about this openness in sharing resources, even if, we're from a different denomination. I'm attending a evangelical church, and it's an international church with mostly Filipinos, but also other Asian attend the church. But we are renting a Catholic church here in Utrecht. So we have a very good relationship with the Catholic Church, and I think it's the reality, as you said now, that there's a lot of support for each other, trying to reach the neighborhood. We haven't planned yet a joint project, but I think what I really appreciate with your sharing is the idea of changing the conversation in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And we have yet to do that, and it's also part of it's actually the title of my dissertation, Conversation Before Conversion. And so it's really I think where we need to start with, I think, as you said, how to renew our relationship with the neighborhood, to renew also the church. So I have just one question while the others are so also thinking about the questions that they want to ask. Our church is also going through a transition. So we have a new pastor for about a year now, but the church has been here for 2 decades already. So now we have a new pastor. So is there anything also, because I think as I was listening to your presentation, I think a transition would be a good time also to try new things. And you said that it's actually the challenge of renewing the congregation, to try new things. But are there some things that can will make it easier for the pastor who is transitioning, who's going in, and for the pastor who is going out, also for the congregation to make the most of it? Question.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, in all these situations, obviously, when the first 12 months of a new pastor coming in is obviously that's a great opportunity for trying new things, because usually there's most churches give a period of grace where they're perhaps willing to be a bit more flexible than they've been in the past. So so that first 12 months is should be an opportunity to look at everything afresh and ask that question. So what is God saying to us now that's that's different, that's new, and yeah, to go through those basic questions, particularly, you know, how do we change the conversation with our neighborhood? How do we spot the people of peace? How do we see what's our 2 or 3 best opportunities, and let's just get some wins on the board, because that builds faith in terms of what's possible. I think in that broader context, now this doesn't apply to all parts of Europe, but in many parts of Europe, one of God's great strategies is to send people from other continents where the church is strong. And there are millions of Christians who've come to Europe, and they are a tremendous gift to the existing church. Now, if we can be open as existing congregations to these new Christians that are coming in, and learn how to not only make them welcome, but to see how to draw upon their gifts, then that's a fantastic opportunity for the renewal of congregations. Now, I realize that not every nation in Europe has such people coming in, but actually it's surprising how many people are coming in. Maybe even they're coming in as refugees, maybe even they're Muslims at the moment, but actually there's an opportunity there to do something completely different. And sometimes God uses completely new people groups to renew the church. And one of the things I love about Christians from other continents is they still have this sense, if I could put it this way, God is still the agent in their lives. And very often for existing Christians in the West, actually God is no longer the agent, we've become the agent. Now, we still ask God for help, but we somehow think that actually it's all our responsibility. So God is kind of in the background, but there isn't that deep sense that, you know, God is present and is going to do something amazing. We just take that for granted. God is going to do something amazing. That sense of God's presence is so strong amongst Christians who are coming in for the first time to Europe, that it's a tremendous gift for us. I've just come back from Istanbul, where I was working with a congregation of Ethiopians in the middle of Turkey, in the middle of Istanbul. And it was just amazing to see their faith and their determination to reach Turkish people. It was brilliant. Now, the existing churches had given up on reaching Muslim people, but they haven't. And I think they're going to succeed.
Martin, you mentioned at the beginning a church that was replanting or having some success replanting earlier. And I couldn't remember when I was writing notes if it was Trinity or you had mentioned kind of the name of it. Do you recall who that was?
Yeah, Holy Trinity Brompton. That's
Gotcha.
HTB. That's the church that started the Alpha course. And one of the amazing things about that church is that they've worked with, they're an Anglican church, they've worked with their diocese. In the diocese, there are many church buildings with tiny congregations, maybe just 12 or 15 people. And by working with the bishop, they've been able to send in 50, 70, 100 people with fresh leadership and a fresh congregation and literally replant the church. And they've done that, I think, about 20 times in the London area, not too far from where their own congregation is. Now, some of those congregations have become 500, 1,000 strong and are themselves acting to replant other churches. So it's quite a growing movement. And then beyond that, they've entered into a partnership with the Church of England more generally, with the idea of trying to plant a similar kind of church in every diocese in the country. And the idea is that those new plants will develop the resources to be able to replant struggling congregations in each diocese. So I think it's just a very encouraging development.
What have you noticed in that scenario? I think the trouble we have, or we're seeing, at least in my denomination in America, is just churches raising up leaders to be able to send out. And so in that case, in say in Holy Trinity's case, have you noticed that they're sending 50 people, they're sending 100 people into that church building with someone that's already raised up, ordained, ready to go, leading them?
Yeah, I mean, they're not just sending individuals, they're sending leadership teams. So that's back to the point that we were making before. Leadership is always more than one. It's much stronger if you can send a leadership team. So that would include, in their case, musicians. It would include those who've got the capacity to run small groups, those who've got the capacity to disciple new believers, those who've got the capacity to run inquiry groups for potential believers. So they're sending teams of workers, not just worshippers. And of course, that immediately transforms the finances. It transforms the worship. It transforms the prayer life of the church. It transforms everything. Now, not every denomination is in a position to send out 100 people. But even if you can send out, relatively small teams, the sending of a team rather than just one person can make a decisive difference. I think that's actually quite important, because I think if you just send one person into a situation that's been in decline for some time, often that's not enough resource to transform the situation. So trying to develop teams to send out is actually quite important.
So I would like to ask everyone if we can have a last round of questions. I think some had to leave early. If you see the chat box, Martin Graham had to leave early, and also Jack Graham, and then also Gustavo. But we have a few more minutes for round of questions. Anything else you would like to ask? I think I would maybe just ask one last question, Martin, about how do you, so I think it was asked already, or mentioned earlier, about bringing, we were just talking about it earlier. So bringing a team in to the church. From your experience, what are the things that we need to consider in choosing that, like someone first to invite as a guest speaker, or just immediately someone like a program, or is it better, like, if it's just when you're going to do it, just do it in one go, or to do it gradually, introducing changes. I don't know, or they're both like depends. I don't really know, but what from your experience would was more effective generally?
Well, every situation is obviously a little bit different, so there's not a one size fits all. But in general, I think the most important thing is that the team that's coming in needs to be in a long-term dialogue with the church that they're going to, so that there's a clear understanding of what's going to happen. And once the new team comes, in a sense, it's got to be quite decisive. these are the things that we've agreed, needs to probably even be in writing, these are the things that we've agreed, and as soon as they come, those things are going to be done. Because otherwise, you'll quickly find that you get sucked into the old culture. So there needs to be a transformation of that culture, and the bringing in of the new team is the opportunity to do that. So it sounds a bit cruel, but actually it's essential. Otherwise, the opportunity will be wasted if you don't have a clear understanding. And that might take quite a bit of negotiating. It might even take 6 months or so to build the relationship, build the trust, build the understanding, build the agreement, and then once it actually happens, to make sure that that new way of doing things actually takes effect. And I would also recommend that somebody is used in the situation, maybe that's got a bit of authority from the denomination, to ensure that there's no backtracking on the agreement. So that there needs to be maybe even somebody that moderates a little bit in the transition to make sure that it goes smoothly. Those can be helpful things.
Thank you, Morgan.
So if those are all the questions, with your permission, I'd like to pray for everybody.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah, let's just take a minute. So Heavenly Father, thank you that you have not abandoned Europe, that you look at Europe as this very special mission field, that you have been preparing your people for something extraordinary to happen. And Lord, we look forward to a complete change in the spiritual atmosphere in Europe, that new leaders will be raised up, that new congregations will be planted, but that also these precious congregations that have been there for a long time will be renewed and revived. Lord, I pray for each individual here that's been on the call tonight, that you would bless their ministry, that you would encourage them, that you would cause them to have faith, and that even in these next few weeks, they would see evidence of your hand at work, that we might see your kingdom extended, established, and growing. In Jesus' name, amen.